Thanks for joining us today. So you can learn a little bit more about radon. I'm Peter Ashley with HUD's Office of Lead Hazard Control and Healthy Homes. We're involved in providing technical assistance on lead and other healthy homes issues, both outside of HUD and within the department. We assist other program offices. So if we can start on the next slide, please. Okay, so this is what we're going to cover today. We'll have an overview of radon by Bruce Sneed, and then we're going to move into measuring radon in multifamily buildings by Kyle Hoylman. I wanted to introduce the next two speakers. We have great speakers for you today, very knowledgeable. I think, you know, the best in the country really at what they're talking about. The first is Bruce Sneed. He's going to give a radon overview. Bruce is Director of Engineering Extension at Kansas State University and has been a state extension specialist in residential energy radon and indoor air quality since 1982. He has conducted radon industry training since 1989, has also led Kansas State's role in the Kansas Radon Program and the National Radon Program Services effort for EPA since 2009. This program provides technical assistance through toll-free phone lines and online at sosradon.org. So take advantage of those resources. I'm sure Bruce will put up that website again. Bruce has also served on the Manhattan, Kansas Public Housing Authority Board when he was a city commissioner and mayor. Following Bruce, you will be hearing from Kyle Hoylman. Kyle's going to talk about radon testing. Kyle co-founded Protect Environmental in 2005, where he currently serves as its managing partner. He's led the company in the completion of more than 5,900 radon and chemical vapor intrusion projects across the country. Kyle currently serves on the EPA Vapor Intrusion Science Advisory Committee, the National Radon Action Plan Leadership Team, and he chairs the Standards Management Committee developing ANSI standards for radon and chemical vapor intrusion. He was elected to President of the American Association of Radon Scientists and Technologists, or ARST, in 2020, and serves on the board of directors. So with that, let's, Bruce, thank you.
Great, thank you, Peter. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon, and Kyle, and hopefully we're going to meet your needs for radon information. And so I look forward to this webinar with you. Next slide, please. So it's been an interesting year involving indoor air quality, and never have I seen such a focus on air quality in buildings as we have seen due to the pandemic and COVID. So radon is an indoor air quality contaminant. We'll learn more about that here, but it's an indoor air quality problem. And this slide is intended to help us understand dealing with indoor air quality and a very kind of simple construct. You've got people that are affected by something. The most common indoor air quality problem is I'm too hot or I'm too cold. Thermal comfort is a typical problem. But there are other problems as well, things associated with things like mold, things like radon. So you have people that are experiencing symptoms, and I know all of you that manage PHAs deal with these kinds of issues. And you've got sources or contaminants that are creating problems for people. They may be responding to symptoms like carbon monoxide, which can cause flu-like symptoms. And carbon monoxide coming from combustion is transported via use of combustion appliances or air handling equipment. So when we're trying to diagnose an air quality problem, I think this can be helpful in analyzing the situation. Where is the contaminant? What is the source? How is it getting transported from where it is generated or created to where people are? And with radon, it's a unique situation because it is a naturally occurring contaminant or source that's in the soil spread throughout the Earth's surface. So indoor air quality is a focus, and radon is one contaminant we're certainly concerned with. Next slide, please. Radon is a naturally occurring atomic element. On the periodic table of the elements, if you remember from high school physics and chemistry, it's a radioactive noble gas in its basic form. It's naturally occurring. There are no man-made sources of radon. It's not created by any company or process. It comes from the Earth, from the decay of uranium and radium that are other radioactive elements that produce this gas that can find its way, either is trapped in the soil or can find its way out of the soil into the atmosphere, or potentially into our buildings through gaps and cracks in the foundations. Radon creates no symptoms. We have no way to perceive how much radon we're breathing. We can't see it or smell it. It enters buildings predominantly from the soil underneath the building through gaps and cracks in the foundations. And you see the years and days associated with uranium, radium, and radon. That's the half-life, which is the radioactive life of this element. And you can see that we have long-lived sources. So radon will constantly be generated in the soil. It's basically a steady state provision of this gas into our world and into our environment. So it's quite unique as an environmental hazard in that it is a source of radioactivity for us coming from the Earth's soil and crust. Next slide, please. The reason radon is drawn into our buildings, our homes and structures, is because of air pressure differentials. Air pressure differentials cause movement of air. That's what the wind is, right? Over the Earth's surface, it's pressure differentials, highs and lows that cause movement of air. Well, it's the same kind of thing. It's just on a much finer scale in that there are air pressure differentials that draw or suck or vacuum radon out of the soil through gaps and cracks in our foundations into the homes and buildings that we occupy. And so while you have a house that looks like the one on the left, it actually kind of works like the one on the right and creates a suction, even though it's very small and it's hard to even sense it. You need sometimes sensitive pressure sensing equipment to detect it. But these are air pressure differentials, and that's drawing radon out of the soil into our homes. And that's the primary mechanism by which radon enters our homes and buildings. Here's the depiction in a cross-sectional drawing of the pathways that radon is commonly drawn in from the soil. Remember, it's an atomic element. It's an atom of gas. So a 1/16 of an inch floor crack and a radon atom is kind of like a ping pong ball in the Grand Canyon. It can get through there. So radon may enter through cracks in the floor, through utility penetrations in the floor. If you have a crawl space type foundation, there may be open soil right underneath, obviously, the entire footprint of the building. Utility penetrations, anything that provides an air pathway between the soil and the interior air of the home can be a means by which radon enters. Sump pits, floor wall joints where the concrete has been poured up against the wall, where there's a gap created there, either intentionally or unintentionally. All of these are pathways through which radon can enter into buildings. Next slide, please. Transitions take a little bit of time. So what's important is what radon does to us. Radon is a long-term source of increased potential for developing lung cancer, and that's it. It is a chronic long-term risk, exposing us to radiation in our lungs that can create cancer in the living cells of the lung. As such, as a source of radiation, there's no safe level of radon. And we'll learn more about the levels here in some subsequent slides. The only way to know the radon level anywhere is to test. We can't predict radon concentrations in homes or buildings based on house age, how tight the building is, what kind of heating and cooling system it has, what kind of building materials it's made with, what kind of foundation it has. All of that just doesn't matter. The only way to know is to test. And so that's why the Surgeon General has recommended that all homes, schools be tested for radon, because we can't tell from a variety of factors which is high and which is low. So radon is a source of radiation, and what radon turns into is actually the mechanism by which our lungs are exposed. It's called radon decay products. Radioactive materials or atoms undergo decay and produce additional atoms which may be radioactive, and is the case with radon. So when radon decays, it produces elements polonium 218 and 214, which are the alpha particle emitters, which emit the radioactive emissions inside our lungs that can cause damage to the DNA of our lungs, either physically or chemically. And those cells, when they're and DNA, when they're damaged, they may repair themselves, they may die, or they may mutate and replicate. And so these radon decay products, which are in the air that we're breathing, these are heavy metals, polonium, lead, bismuth, and the other form of polonium are heavy metals that can lodge in our respiratory tract, and where they can deliver this potential emission that can cause damage to living cells. So radon is the source, and that's why we measure radon, because it tells us the maximum amount of these radioactive decay products that are possible. Radon has a half-life of about 3.8 to 4 days. So it's around for a sufficient period of time, and it's constantly being generated in the soil underneath our homes and buildings. Next slide, please. So radon decay products are a health concern because they are easily inhaled. They are heavy metals. They will lodge. They are chemically reactive, so they can lodge in our respiratory tract and penetrate deeply into the lung, where these emissions can damage sensitive lung tissue. And that's it. It'd be nice if we could tell how much radon we're breathing, but we can't. And so this is the concern. It's a chronic long-term risk, not a short-term risk. That's why we're concerned with the average radon concentrations in buildings. We measure for 2 to 7 days, or even for a longer period, 3 months to 1 year, as you'll learn when Kyle presents the information later on. Next slide, please. So it's ionizing radiation that we're concerned about. And this just is a depiction of what an alpha particle emission from one of the 2 polonium decay products can do, causing transformation, ionization of cells in the lung, the DNA of cells in the lung. And if there's a comparison for this, they're like little atomic bullets. And we all know about bullets, right? We try and avoid exposure to bullets. The more bullets we're exposed to, the greater the potential for damage. And this is basically an analogy for what's going on in our lungs. One bullet actually could be the cause of development of lung cancer. But the more bullets we're exposed to, the greater the risk. Next slide, please. Making radon palpable and visible is a challenge. And this is about a 1 and 15-second video that Jennifer will run for us that I'll let you see. And it makes radon decays visible using a device called a cloud chamber.
Radon is everywhere, even in this classroom. If you look in this cloud chamber, you'll see tracks left by alpha particles from radon atoms that happened to be in the chamber when the lid was put on. Those short, bright streaks you see in there are the radon alphas. Notice that there are only a few alpha trails in the chamber at any time. This is a very low level of radon that we don't need to worry about. But in certain parts of the country, there are houses with a lot of radon in their basements. What would the cloud chamber look like in one of these basements? This basement has been measured with a radon level of 100 picocuries per liter. Come look at this.
Oh my God. My bed is radioactive.
I've never seen anything like that before.
Let me give you a brief explanation of what you just saw. It's a cloud chamber, which is a mechanism that uses a supersaturated vapor that's chilled by the dry ice to make the radioactive emissions of alpha particles visible. And you can saw in the early part of it that there were very few. That's about a 1 picocurie, or a measurement of 1 picocurie per liter of radon in air. And then they went to a bedroom, deployed it where it had been measured at 100 picocuries per liter of air. So you were seeing those alpha particle emissions. And that's what we're breathing when we're breathing radon, is these radioactive emissions. So let's move to the next slide. So when we look at what this exposure to radon means, this pie chart of the average exposure of a US citizen to all sources of radiation is helpful. Radon and thoron, which is another less significant radioactive gas, but radon, over a third of the average US citizen's exposure to all forms of radiation comes from radon in the buildings and homes where they spend time. Obviously, we have a lot of medical procedures that provide exposure, but it is radon as a naturally occurring source of radiation that we're concerned about. And what we want to try and do is minimize our exposure as much as possible. We can't eliminate it because radon is everywhere, but the goal is to reduce it as low as reasonably achievable. And we'll talk about those measurement levels here in the coming slides. Next slide, please. What really gives us a strong scientific basis about the risk associated with radon exposure is the studies that have been done of people, not just animals, but people in different environments, both mining as well as residential environments around the globe. And the committee called the Biological Effects of Ionizing Radiation, the BEER committee, had developed for EPA this risk estimate based on the science of 21,000 radon-related lung cancer deaths every year in the United States. There's an uncertainty associated with that, but it is a significant source of lung cancer. And again, as we'll see, these are based on studies of human exposure as well. Next slide. To get a sense for the impact of radon-related lung cancer on the US population, you can see this chart here. From 2020, cancer mortality, lung and bronchus cancer is the #1 cause of death, cancer-related death in the United States. You can see that there's colon, rectal, pancreas, prostate, other cancers you're familiar with. Radon-induced lung cancer alone is basically the 8th leading cause of cancer death in the United States. So it is a significant health risk for us. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about radon, we need to understand the basics of measurement and the units of measurement. We measure radon in air in what a unit's called picocuries per liter of air. And the fundamental definition is 2.22 radioactive emissions per minute in a liter of air. That's 1 picocurie per liter. So this is a very small amount of radiation. It's pretty amazing that we're capable of accurately measuring radon concentrations down to 1 picocurie per liter of air and even lower. And so this is the unit. The references we have for this are shown in white. The EPA Radon National Action Guideline is 4 picocuries per liter. The World Health Organization has a reference level of 2.7. The US average indoor concentration, if you were to measure radon in your homes, which I would encourage all of you to do, the living area might be around 1.3 picocuries per liter. And outdoors, in outdoor air, radon is actually about 0.4 picocuries per liter. So these are the radon concentrations we find in our environment. But the only way to know the radon level anywhere is to test. and then you compare those results with this action guidelines. To get a sense for the risk, EPA has developed the risk tables that are in their public documents, the Citizens Guide to Radon and the Home Buyers and Sellers Guide to Radon. And the way they showed this risk is by depiction of lifetime risk of lung cancer death from exposure at certain levels for a certain period of time. And in this case, it's a lifetime. So this represents about 70 years with about 18 hours a day in a home. And out of 100,000 people exposed to radon levels you see in the left-hand column, how many, either smokers or never smokers, has two different categories, might be expected to develop lung cancer in their lifetime. We've highlighted 4 picocuries per liter, and for never smokers, out of 100,000, 730 would be expected to get lung cancer. For smokers, it's 9 times that risk. And because smoking and radon are multiplicative. And I know public housing authorities deal with smoking issues. And so when people smoke and are exposed to radon, the risk actually is multiplicative. So these are significant levels of risk. If radon was man-made, it would have been regulated far more than the advisory and guidance that is provided to you today. Next slide. As I said, the basis of the health risk estimates associated with radon are on exposures of people, not only mining exposures around the globe, which is the cohorts of miners that were followed for their exposure and development of lung cancer, but there have been residential case control studies around the world. And you can see those kind of summarized here in terms of the numbers associated with these studies. And what's important here is these are measurements and assessments of actual risk, and these have confirmed the risk associated with radon that we share with you today. Next slide. I recognize a guy with a beard and a ponytail from Kansas State University might not be the most credible person you ever met, but all of these associations and agencies and health organizations say the same thing about radon. It's a serious national health problem, and all homes should be tested. And that includes multifamily homes and high rise and low rise and duplexes and all of those. Next slide, please. So we know that radon is everywhere in greater or lesser concentrations. And this is helpful to look at the US EPA relative radon risk map developed in 1993 to get a sense of where there might be greater or lesser potential for radon to be found in homes and buildings. The reality is it doesn't matter where you are. The only way to know is to test. If you were to live in a county with a low level of risk, like the yellow ones you see here, you may still have a home that tests high. If you live in a county with a high level of potential risk, like many you see here, you may also live in a home that tests low. The only way to know is to test. Each county in the country was ranked according to 5 factors for the potential risk, and you can see that depicted here. Many states have more current results, much have added to their database since 1993, and I encourage all of you to look at the state radon program information in the states where you have your PHAs and housing authorities. So the map's purpose was to focus awareness back in 93 and to encourage radon resistant new construction so that new structures built would be low, have the potential for low levels of radon. Again, this map is not a predictive map, it's a potential map. Next slide, please. This is an important slide because it depicts in the dots and colors and shapes you see measurements of radon in a community. It happens to be in Wisconsin. And you can see that the legend shows test results from less than 4 in green dots to stars where the radon results were greater than 30 picocuries per liter. And if you look at the black circles on the map, you can see there are areas where there are stars and red dots and triangles, and immediately adjacent to them, what's there? Green dots. So this shows that, yes, there are areas in a community, this one, for example, where there is likely to be a higher frequency of homes testing 4 picocuries per liter or more. but the only way to know is to test. And just because your neighbor's house is high doesn't mean yours will be. It certainly helps with awareness. And if you have housing projects that have tested high, it's an indicative that there may be potential for elevated concentrations nearby as well, but the only way to know is to test. Next slide. Almost all states, I think 49 out of 50, have state indoor radon programs funded through EPA to help with awareness and resources and information about testing and all of that. Some states require certification or licensure of those who test or fix. For example, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Kansas, Nebraska, Minnesota, Florida, New Jersey. So it's important for you to look for information from your state radon program. And you can see the website, sosradon.org state fact sheets. These are available. You can see the website behind me here in my backdrop. I encourage you to go to the sosradon.org website and download the fact sheet on your state, because there may be good information that you can use in assessing your housing projects and properties, and information about radon levels in adjacent areas and counties, as well as other resources that you may be able to take advantage of. Next slide, please. Kyle will talk on this, but I just want to share with you that there are standards developed through a consensus-based process, our ANSI standards, and you see the three most relevant ones for, I believe, our audience today: protocols for conducting measurements of radon in homes, measurements of radon in multifamily buildings, and measurements of radon in schools and large buildings. These standards are viewable for free online, but to have a paper copy, you need to either purchase them and pay, have them sent, or download them. But these are the documents that you should reference and have on hand when you are determining how you will proceed and what's important in conducting radon measurements in multifamily buildings and in the field. Next slide, please. Other resources that I wanted to share with you come from our Kansas Radon Program website. These may be of benefit for you. Indoor air quality guides certainly address this. Radon Guide for Tenants, that's the Illinois Emergency Management Agency, and the Radon Guide for Tenants. Next slide, please. Here is a list of resources that may be of benefit for you. Here at Kansas State University, we, since 2009, have answered tens of thousands of calls from the public across the country about radon. And that's our radon hotline, 800-767-7236. Our sosradon.org website has lots of resources. The most common questions we get are in those question bubbles behind me. You can download EPA documents in English and Spanish for a citizen's guide to radon, home buyers and sellers, which is certainly where a lot of radon testing occurs, as well as a consumer's guide to radon reduction, helping people understand what it takes to reduce radon. And that's a good point to share, is when you find high levels of radon, there are standard approaches to reducing radon that can effectively get radon levels down below 4 picocuries per liter consistently, and many times below 2. And then other resources there include ARST, its National Proficiency Program for voluntary certification for those who are voluntarily certified to test or fix if their state doesn't require it, and the National Radon Safety Board, which is another voluntary certification program. So you, as public housing authorities, when you engage with radon, are likely to engage with voluntarily or required certified radon measurement professionals to work with you on radon testing in your properties. Next slide, please. I think that wraps it up for me. I've probably gone a little bit long, takes a little longer for slide transitions, but this just is a little bit of information about me. I would be happy to help you and respond to questions. My contact information will be shared as part of the presentation, and I thank you for your attention and look forward to working with HUD to help you in public housing authorities take positive action in regards to radon. Thanks.
Thanks, Bruce. This is Kyle Hoyleman. Greetings, folks, from Louisville, Kentucky. I'm going to be wrapping up the webinar today with actually talking through how radon presents itself in existing buildings and how we identify and characterize those buildings. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Based on Bruce's presentation, I grabbed a couple slides and pulled them up. We have primarily talked about the, all right, video is now on. We talked about the primary source of radon being soil gas, and that is roughly 90–95% of what we deal with in the United States. I do just want to point out that there are a couple other sources. When you get into let's say the southern part of Florida, where you have hurricane-proof buildings constructed with concrete floor and wall systems. It's very common there to see that the source of the radon is actually emanating from the concrete building material. We test and characterize the building the same, but we mitigate differently. We mitigate with ventilation versus active soil depressurization. When you get into the northeastern part of our country with private well source, a lot of times you'll run into the water supply being the source of radon. It's off-gassing. So just keep in mind that there are three main sources. The most prevalent source is radon intrusion into buildings through the soil. We talked through the entry points. I'm not going to hit on those, but let's go to the next slide. One of the things that Bruce hit on was the way within a community, towards the end of his presentation, the black stars and the green, and how we can have streets with very widely varying radon concentrations. I thought it might even be beneficial to bring that into a building because radon presents itself differently in the building based on pathways. And here's an example of a building in Nashville, Tennessee. And you can see here on the right, these values are actually radon levels. So if you look at the bottom left of that, you have a 2.2. And directly across the hall, you have 3 units, 18.7, 18.3, and 27.0. And then you transition to 3.4. Very similar to what Bruce pointed out at the neighborhood level, but also understanding that that is the same in the building level. So how can you have that? Let's take a look at the next slide. Radon, you have to have 3 things in order to have radon present itself in a building. First of all, you have to have a source. You have to have a pathway into the building, and then you have to have a driving force. So the source is radon. The pathway are the gaps, the cracks, the crevices, and the things like that that Bruce alluded to. And then if you'll recall the slide that had the vacuum cleaner next to the house, that's our driving force. Is it a thermal stack effect? Is it a mechanical driving force? But something to actually pull the radon into the structure itself through the pathway. So in that Nashville scenario, what's actually going on? Well, you can see here that the image to the left, that's what's under this building. These are continuous grade beams or footers. They're 11 inches wide, 14 inches deep. So it's very hard for soil gas to pass through those barriers. As you move to the right of the screen, you see that here's 3 units, and each of those units are even further broken up. So the light blue unit, that's 1 unit, but it's really potentially 2 pathways or source areas that could come into the building. And then you see how that plays through. So you have a hallway, and that's what's happening. You see buildings, it's not uncommon in multifamily and other large buildings to see, for example, a wing of a nursing home have a source, a pathway, and a driving force, and radon presents itself in that area of the building, and the other 5 wings in the building will not have that same characteristic. That's why we do a lot of the things that we do that are different from man-made products. So a lot of times we'll be asked, well, when we screen for asbestos or we screen for lead-based paint, we're not measuring 100% or sampling 100% of everything in that building. Why do we do that with radon? And the answer is source, pathway, driving force, the things that you're seeing on your screen now, versus man-made materials. If I have lead-based paint in one windowsill, I'm probably going to have lead-based paint in other windowsills and in other buildings. That's why it's appropriate to characterize a building with 10% or 25% screening versus what we do with radon. So I wanted to just provide some of that intro before we get into really the meat and potatoes of today. What I'm going to go through, a lot of information. I'll go through it as quickly as possible, but just the concept of the qualified radon professional. What standard do we use to characterize buildings? The characterization process itself. What are the devices that we use? Active devices, passive devices. How do we make sure that those devices are providing accurate, precise results that don't introduce bias? What's the measurement process and the options? There are several options to characterize a building. What goes into the planning? What conditions need to be maintained in order to have a valid measurement event? What notifications need to take place for residents to understand what's going on? What are the costs associated with measurement? And then understanding that the audience is largely made up of public housing officials. What are some options for that? So the first concept is just that of the qualified radon professional. As defined by the standard, qualified radon professional is credentialed by one of the two EPA recognized proficiency programs. That's NRPP or NRSB, and licensed in the applicable state if that state has licensure requirements. That qualified radon professional is trained and certified, and they're responsible for providing that direct on-site supervision for the radon activities. This professional would be responsible for reporting, supervising the testing and mitigation, and then finally your long-term stewardship obligations, ongoing operation and maintenance and monitoring. As a point of interest, there are 40 states with radon laws in effect. If you go to eli.org, that's the Environmental Law Institute, you can pull down that list and get an overview of what those laws are. As it pertains to the qualified radon professional and licensure, 20 states, 19 states have licensure requirements. 13 of those states require the ANSI standard, and then there's one state right now, Colorado, that's actually moving to licensure status. Next slide, please. The standard that's applied is the ANSI standard. As Bruce pointed out, that standard is available at standards.arch.org. It's free to view, pay to download. But the key components of that, again, we've defined the qualified radon professional. We're going to characterize buildings by measuring 100% of the ground floor contact units in the building, and then 10% of the upper floor units. Why do we do that? Well, we talked about ground floor characterization. We also talked about these other sources. It's not uncommon in Miami, for example, to see radon in the 18th, 19th, and 20th floor of the building because the source is not the soil. The source is the actual concrete. And so we're screening these upper floors to make sure that we don't have a preferential pathway through a stairwell, an elevator shaft, or things of that nature. And at the same time, taking into consideration those two other sources. Is it coming through the water supply or is it emanating from the building material? That's why we screen upper floors. Residential versus non-residential spaces. We get asked that question a lot. And the answer is, if the space is occupied, then it's part of the measurement event. And that's the guidance. We focus on occupied areas of the building versus non-occupied. And this is a change in the standard where if it's occupied, of course, we're going to include it. If it's intended to be occupied, we're going to include that. But if it's not occupied, we're simply going to take the position that this area was not occupied at the time of the characterization. If this area, for whatever reason, does become or is intended to become occupied in the future, the recommendation is to measure that area prior to occupancy as part of your long-term stewardship obligation. There are exemptions in the standard, what should be tested, when is it appropriate not to test. There are also extenuating factors. We understand if you're testing or screening 100% of a building, there are going to be dogs, there are going to be areas that you can't access for whatever reason, and the standard takes into account those extenuating factors and provides guidance for the qualified radon professional to complete a building characterization using a threshold of valid measurement results and applying that to those areas that might have an invalid result. Radon zones. All zones are treated equally in the standard. We're going to talk through that here in just a moment. Why are we testing in low risk areas? I'll show you some sample data on that. The conditions that need to be maintained, I'm going to go through that a little later, as well as the notifications. And then finally, the standard does utilize the EPA action level of 4 picocuries per liter of air for mitigation action. What we're talking about now are just a couple of those things 100%. Why do we test 100%? We've hit it as far as source and pathway. Here are a couple examples of that in action. Here's a Connecticut property in Connecticut. You can see here on the left that we were screening 10 to 25% in each of these buildings. So top left, we screened 5 out of the 17 units. Bottom right, we screened 2 out of the 8 units. So we had 70 buildings. We had 80 residential units in this example. And let's go to the next slide. What we found was the initial 25% screening, we saw no radon present in the buildings 4 and 5. Now we did a 100% follow-up here because the client wanted that information. And what we found was we actually mischaracterized those 2 buildings. And in fact, there were 16 units in those buildings that were found to contain radon concentrations above the action level. So you're able to see why that screening approach that's taken with asbestos and lead-based paint really doesn't apply with radon, an actually occurring source of radiation. The follow-up here identified 16 residentials in those 2 buildings, and there was actually a total of 44 additional units across the property that were identified through full characterization. Next slide, please. We did the same thing in Lexington, Kentucky. This was a Freddie Mac transaction. Freddie Mac only requires 10% screening. So we put out 18 devices in 18 buildings. There were a total of 144 ground contact units at this property. 14 of those devices came back elevated. The policy requirement at that point would have been to just simply mitigate just those 14 units, not even any other unit in the building. The 100% assessment actually showed that there was 108 of the 144 residential units in the building contained a radon problem. All 18 buildings contained a radon problem. 16 of the units that were not in the initial screening actually contained radon levels above 30 picocuries. So quite high level of radiation that these folks would have been exposed to. End result here was the client chose to mitigate those 108 units as opposed to the 14 that the lender would have required, and as a result, eliminated that liability. Next slide, please. So that all starts to culminate in a study that was funded through HUD. It's called the EARTH study. And here's just one slide or one data point table off of that study. You can see over to the left number of ground contact units, 5 to 6 up to 21 to 26. Next column are the total number of buildings that fell in that range. And then if you look at the first 2 columns, that's really what we're seeing with lending driven policy out there today. Which is the leading indicator or the leading reason that multifamily buildings are being measured in today's environment. 10%, that would be Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. 25% would have been the previous HUD map or multifamily. And you can see that at sampling 10%, you're going to mischaracterize the building anywhere between 45 up to 60% plus, roughly a 60% mischaracterization of the building. Even increasing that to 25%, you're still missing about 40% of the time radon units in these buildings that would have a concentration above the action level. And that's really a lot of what led to some of the data-driven policy process that HUD's used to evaluate its program as it's moved forward. Next slide. When you start to talk about using the radon map in a zone 3, we get the question all the time, well, why are we testing in areas where there's no radon? And that's really not the intent of the map. As Bruce mentioned in his presentation, the EPA recommends that all buildings be tested. Here's an example of radon in Florida. If you look at these 3 counties, Lee, Henry, and Collier County, you would say, well, that's low risk. When in fact, if you look at these zip codes based on the number of measurements, which are statistically significant, you find out that there's a lot of radon in this area of the country. As a matter of fact, some of these counties, as many as 1 in 3 buildings contain radon concentrations above the action level. And that's why that zone 3 really should be set aside. It's all buildings and all zones need to be tested. Next slide. A couple other examples. Recent stuff from just the last few months that I pulled. Frisco, Texas. Yeah, there's no radon in Frisco, Texas, unless you actually test for it. So zone 3, 35 of 72 locations were above the action level with the highest level of 16.5, quite high level in an area that's low risk. One more example, next slide, please, in North Carolina. Coastal, Fayetteville, North Carolina, zone 3 area, there's no radon there unless you test. And there were 18 of 51 locations that were above the action level with the highest concentration of 12. Next slide, please. So that's why we test 100%. That's why we test 10% of upper floors. That's why we test in all zones, all risk. And one other concept that comes up from time to time is during new construction. And the question is, well, can we characterize the soil or the land before we construct the building and let that be the determination on whether to put passive soil gas control systems in these buildings? Here's a site in Texas where they've laid this out. Now I'll just point out here, HUD's position on the housing side, the multifamily side, is for new construction projects, pre-construction testing is not possible. The concept here is to drill an 18-inch hole, throw some test devices in there, cover them up, and 3 days later, pull these out and let that determine whether you're going to have a radon problem or the potential for a radon problem or not. Next slide. This is the reason that really doesn't work because here's what the site looks like. So here at the top, where we have topsoil, that's where we're coring these 18-inch holes. But the radon or the radium is actually in the clay and in the shale when they start to do the excavation. So really all that method, all we achieve with that type of method is we're looking at what the volume may be, not the concentration in the building. Because without a building envelope and without the ability to understand if there are preferential pathways or a driving force, the source is irrelevant at this point in time. So that's why soil sampling is not an adequate way to characterize the potential for radon in new construction. Next slide, please. So we've talked about why we test what we test. Zone 3, 100%, 10% upper screening. We don't sample soil. There's no reason to do that. How do we test? Well, we test with measurement devices, and there are different deployment periods. So short-term testing, which is most prevalent in multifamily housing, those devices are really set up for typically 2 to 5, maybe 7 days. The true definition of short-term testing would be 0 to 90 days. Most of these take place over a period of 48 to 72 hours, maybe up to a week. Long-term testing, that is 91 days and greater, typically up to a year. And there are some benefits to that in multifamily testing because of some of the conditions, but there are also disadvantages that in that a lot of your devices end up missing when you're characterizing that way. The active devices, which will not be prevalent within multifamily just because of the cost of the device. These devices typically run anywhere from $700, $800 up to several $1,000s each. So when you're testing 100%, it's not really economically feasible to use active devices. They're typically used for more of diagnostic testing when you're doing an investigation of some sort. The active devices are known as continuous radon monitors. There's a picture of the active device to the bottom right of the graphic. The passive devices, which are the devices that the housing authorities will typically use. There's different devices, activated charcoal absorption. It's measuring the gamma in the charcoal that's in the device. Alpha track devices could that measures the alpha strike, which is a form of that radioactive decay product that Bruce mentioned. It's a result of that. Electric ion chambers and liquid scintillation. These are all devices that are used for short-term building characterization. Next slide, please. So with these devices, we need to make sure that we're delivering accurate, precise measurement results with as little bias as possible or no bias. That's the function of our quality assurance program. With active devices, we need to calibrate the device annually, and we need to cross-check, and that means every 10th device that we put out, we're going to make sure that that it's cross-checked with another device or a duplicate device. With passive devices, we're spiking. And what spiking is before the lot goes out into the field for deployment, we're sending that to a known source or a chamber. It's being exposed to a known concentration, and then the lab actually analyzes that to make sure it's within tolerance. That's done typically before the testing event. At the time of the test, we're putting out duplicates. We want to make sure that the precision is in place for that duplicate testing, and then blanks. We want to make sure that there's no bias, meaning from the time that I take that device out of the unit until the time it shows up wherever it's going. That there's no other exposure to that device that could result in a false negative or a false positive. A thing that comes to mind there, if you had a box of devices on a FedEx truck and they were next to a shipment of the old Coleman kerosene lantern, the little white mantles, those emit radiation. So there's the potential of seeing a false positive come back through bias. And the way that we eliminate that is basically send a device that hasn't been exposed. We open it, we immediately close it, put it in with the transit, and it's analyzed as well. And it should come back at the lower limit of detection. QA investigations, that needs to be a part of your QA system, and then you really should be retaining these records for 5 years or whatever the minimum period of the state requirement might be. Next slide, please. 2 protocols. The left protocol is going to be the most prevalent with public housing, and that is you put a single device in, you get the results of the device back, and then from there you can follow up with a short-term device if you have a concentration above 4. You could also follow up with a long-term device as well, and use just the value of that long-term device as long as your initial is below 8 picocuries. The right hand, you're basically putting duplicate devices out everywhere and averaging those. So it's kind of compressing all of that QA, all of your duplicates and everything into one protocol, and you're making a decision off of that single test, not extending with follow-ups and whatnot. That is typically not going to be cost effective for large sampling, and that's the reason that you see the extended testing process utilized more frequently. Next slide, please. From a planning standpoint, these are just some screenshots out of the standard itself. So some of this guidance is there. We're looking at educating the management, making sure that the building folks are on board, the maintenance staff, and then everyone really knows what needs to happen. And here on the right-hand side, these are the things that need to be happening that the management has control over. Exterior windows, exterior doors, making sure that those are closed because we're doing short-term testing. We have conditions that need to be maintained. Heating and cooling systems that might be zoned, might be bring fresh air into the building, into common areas and things like that. Everything needs to be set to normal operating conditions, and there are some special conditions that do apply, as you can see with VAV systems, other things such as if you had return ducts. A lot of your older building stock may have return duct that's sub slab or is in contact with the soil. That creates a unique set of challenges in that it could actively mine or pull radon out of the soil and reintroduce that back into the building. So these are the things that the qualified radon professional is working with the property management or the building owner to make sure that we're creating the right circumstances or the right set of conditions to get a valid sampling event. Next slide, please. And then we have the conditions that the resident needs to maintain. So here's a look at those. Windows need to be kept closed for the duration of the sampling event and 12 hours before. Exterior doors, ingress and egress only. Guidance here for the heating and cooling systems. They need to be operating normally. Other things like, well, what if you have bathroom fans, attic fans, fireplaces? The guidance here is present for that. And then over here on the right, just a little more detail on, hey, what if you have a crawl space in the building? Should the vents be opened or closed? So these are the conditions that need to be maintained through the duration of the testing event to make sure that we're getting a valid result. So when you put the QA with the measurement devices, maintain the conditions, that's really what your qualified radon professional is doing, is making sure that that's set up and administered properly. And I will point out that these are conditions for short-term testing. If you go to long-term testing, the closed building conditions don't apply. However, the unintended consequence of long-term testing is you find that it's difficult to get your devices back. They've been thrown out because they've been in for 3+ months. And so we eliminate one issue and create another issue. It's kind of a catch-22. These areas here are the actual notifications that go out to the residents. One should go out a week or maybe even as soon as early as 2 weeks in advance. And these are public ingress egress areas, letting folks know what's coming. And then you follow up with the other notification that again specifically lays out what those specific closed building conditions that need to be maintained are for the resident. And then this should also be applied again when the device is included. And I will point out that closed building conditions are for the building. We're characterizing the building, not just units in the building. So even if an area is not being tested, it still needs to be maintained. We run into that a lot where, hey, we noticed the 16 people in this building that you were going to test. Well, what about the other 32? We didn't notice those. That's why that planning is essential to make sure you get a good testing event. Next slide, please. Measurement cost. On the measurement side, it's going to average somewhere between $50 to $80 per location. And that would include your QA, your report preparation and things like that. We're running short on time. I know you're all going to get this information. So I'm going to go ahead and just move on and just leave it at $50 to $80 is a good budget range to use when you're discussing building characterization and measurement. Next slide, please. So We have the challenge now of we're a PHA. How do we build an effective radon management program with limited resources? That's the recurring theme, is limited resources. Well, what might that solution look like? There is, we have section 2151 of the standard requires the qualified radon professional to do this direct on-site supervision. But there's also a provision that gives us some flexibility as qualified radon professionals to use unqualified persons under our direct on-site supervision. Unqualified persons may assist in the placement of retrieval devices. They have to be trained. They have to be qualified in the QC documentation and recorded, and go into the work plan. Next slide. So how does that look in practice? Your qualified radon professional, you could work with a single qualified radon professional. That person would develop the measurement and the quality assurance plan for the project. They would come on site, train your maintenance staff on how to deploy the devices, be there to make sure that the chain of custody is maintained, that there's technical assistance and guidance if necessary, log the devices, and then follow through to the lab, the report, and then ultimately maintain your QA measurement system. And the only thing that I'd throw out here is you just need to verify that that approach would meet applicable state laws and regulations. So in my experience, and we've done work in every state, we haven't really run across a state that wouldn't permit this approach, especially under COVID guidance, but you would need to check. Next slide. And that should take us out. Again, my name is Kyle Hoylman, and I'm available to work through any of these items. I know there's a lot of information here. We did a lot in a 30-minute period, and with that, I will step aside and turn it back over to Peter.
And hi, Kyle. I can actually jump in. This is Justin Gray. I work in public housing. And so during the presentations, I've been kind of monitoring the questions and the chats. And there on the screen is all of our contact information. And so I'm going to just kind of group some of the questions together. There are a lot of them that I think we should have said this up front, but we're going to put the recording on HUD Exchange. We're going to have the presentation PowerPoints there as well. And so everybody will get an email when that's ready. As mentioned up front, this is also webinar 1 of 3. And so there's going to be 2 others coming up, and we're going to post them on HUD Exchange as well. So there was a series of questions about the funding that was mentioned in the introduction, and the fiscal year 20. That is run out of the Office of Capital Investments. So that's the CAP Fund office for PHAs. So you'd go to their website for different information, or if the deadlines are extended, that kind of thing. The second one is the demonstration, and that's run out of the Healthy Homes office, which is Peter's office. And that one is still being designed. And so kind of stay tuned, but that's going to be for public housing authorities. And let's see, there were also a series of questions that were kind of more about specific projects or specific policies. And we weren't really going to get into those in this presentation. We put some links in the chat of some of the recent ones for the MAP guide had a presentation, and also the RAD program has some specific radon requirements, and those are both in the chat and they're in the presentations. So that'll be helpful. And those really kind of need their own entire webinar. So the goal really here was, when we looked out at the landscape of guidance, we, at least I saw that there was a lot that was aimed at single family homeowner audience. And so we were trying to, how can we put together a webinar series and different guidance that's more to a multifamily rental more kind of, in a way, a PHA, a multifamily grantee, CPD, ONAP. You're a property manager. You manage a rental portfolio. And how do we put out guidance for that? Because it's different from saying, you know, you homeowner go buy a test and then you send it to the lab. We really wanted to put it in the context of you have a portfolio of rental housing, and how can we give best practices and information to you? So I'm just going to read a few. We'll be monitoring if new questions come in, but I'll read a few of them to kind of get some insights from the speakers. So if you are a HUD grantee, PHA, multifamily, that is not required to do testing. So maybe you're not doing a new underwriting or a new construction activity, but you want to commence testing your portfolio, but you basically can't afford to test the whole portfolio or don't have the resources or want to strategize. What is your advice to those grantees?
I think I think the main advice that I would offer up is to encourage, let's say you have 100 buildings in your portfolio and you only have limited resources. You want to design a measurement program that characterizes buildings as a whole. So don't try to do something in 100 of the buildings. Take 10 of those buildings, fully characterize them. The recommendation is to do that every 5 years. And then maybe the next year, as your new funding cycle or as additional resources become available, take your next group of 10, so on and so forth. Keep it at a building level, and let that guide how you characterize these buildings. Use the resources on a building level.
Great, thanks. So another thing that is occurs with public housing authorities and other grantees is they're embarking on some redevelopment. They're going to do demolition, and then it's going to be followed by new construction. And in that kind of scenario, what is the best sort of strategy and sequencing for, when do you do the testing?
Well, we talked about soil sampling. So we know that we don't want to do that. So as you demolish the building and you're ready to construct your new building, the encouragement there would be to construct the building using passive soil gas control features. At that point, when the building's there, now it goes back to the point that Bruce made. Do we have a source? Do we have pathways into the building? And do we have a driving force? Well, at that point, the building is constructed. Now you can characterize based on that 3 criteria. So construct the building, put the passive soil gas control system in, then test. If the testing indicates that you do have additional mitigation that's required, then you would activate these systems using a fan or a blower, and then you would clear the building again through testing.
Great. So another just sort of typical scenario is you have, whether it's in apartment elevator context or even in a more of a duplex that has ground floor, these are actually very small units and maybe just have like the 4 rooms, or you've got your main room, kitchen, bathroom, bedroom. How, and I know it'll depend, and it's something that they'll work on with the professional that they hire, but generally, how do you talk about sort of measurement conditions in these kind of smaller units that maybe don't have basements?
That goes back to the first question. So you want to test the whole building, even if you have a duplex, and you can go back to the Nashville, Tennessee example that we provided, where these buildings oftentimes will have a firewall, or they'll have a continuous footer over the building. They have separate mechanical systems. So they really are 2 separate structures. They just happen to be located under one roof. So that's how you would characterize it. You would treat it the same. If you have 10 duplexes and you only have, it's 20 devices and you only have in your budget for 10, then only test 5 of the buildings and pick the other 5 up with next year's budget.
Great. And actually, there are just a couple just came in on the Q&A and we're sort of about kind of who's for the mitigation.
Justin, this is Peter. I had one question that I saw on the list that I wanted to pose. There was a question, Kyle, about a 7-story building being tested and whether or not you need to test units on each of the floors.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, and let me just, I'll answer that with an example. We had a 15-story building in Minneapolis. We had radon present on the ground contact area, but there was an elevator that went all the way to the 15th floor, and there was a unit immediately adjacent to that elevator. We ended up, because of our screening, and your upper floor screening needs to be strategic. So don't just put on each floor haphazardly, I'm going to put a device here, here, and here. You want to test to areas, stairwells, elevator shafts, garbage chutes. So at that point, you're able to characterize with that screening. But in that example, Justin, the 15th floor, we had a 5.5 radon concentration in that area. And we were able to determine that the elevator was the preferential pathway and the radon was presenting itself in the 15th floor. The follow-up there was we tested all adjacent areas around that location on the 15th floor to verify that there weren't other preferential pathways that were presenting themselves. We determined that that was not the issue. And then we were looking at can we mitigate the ground floor and actually mitigate that pathway, or is it still presenting itself on the upper floor? And at that point, we would have done some type of fresh air ventilation. Ultimately, we mitigated the ground floor. That short circuited the pathway. The preferential pathway through the elevator shaft was taken away, and we didn't need any further corrective action on the upper floor.
And just one more, Kyle and Bruce, there was a question about manufactured housing. Are there separate, is there separate guidance for mitigating radon in manufactured housing? And I think modern manufactured housing is generally placed on a slab. So I would think that it's no different than other housing that's on a slab foundation, but I defer.
Yeah. We tested a home in Kansas. It was actually a mobile home with tight skirting. And because the underbelly had dropped away, there were pathways through it. There was radon coming out of the soil. So even we had 11.4 in what you'd almost consider a mobile home. So yes, the potential is there. The only way to know is to test. Just because it has a slab or a crawl space or a basement doesn't mean it's going to have or not have radon. The only way to know is to test.
Yeah. Thanks, Bruce.
Yeah, the answer to many questions like this are sometimes, maybe, it depends. The only way to know is to test.
Yeah.
So maybe one more, there was a couple that came in on sort of who pays for the mitigation. And then another one was asking about the funding we mentioned in the beginning. And so, you know, in most cases, it's going to be the HUD grantee. They're the property owner. They're going to be the ones paying for the mitigation. All the different programs are funded differently, but you know, in the case of public housing, it's an eligible expense with formula funding, and there is some competitive grant money available as well. And that was the Office of Capital Investments. So the Cap Fund office run the current grant, and the one that's coming up for the demonstration of testing and mitigation is Healthy Homes. And so that'll be available and publicized as well. And I think I would just sort of thank the presentation. And I think we've got 2 more in this webinar series. And so they're all be made available on the web, the recordings, and we look forward to sharing more guidance and awareness on this subject.
Thank you, Justin, Kyle, and Bruce. Really appreciate, and those of you who've joined us today, and to follow up with any questions that you have. So
Thanks for the opportunity, and tried to answer a number of the questions in the chat, and be happy to answer follow-on questions via email from any of the folks that have attended today.
Yeah, absolutely. Ditto for me. I'm happy to lend and assist with any questions.
all righty. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.
Thanks.
Take care, folks.